little bit of too many turnovers. They definitely slowed the pace down, and at the end of the day, we got to play what works for us. We got to keep our pace high. We got to play our defensive schemes, take care of business on the defensive end, get boards, and run. That's what we're good at. We have great people who are awesome in the open court, and so I just think we lacked pace tonight, honestly.
Caitlin, can you take me through that second quarter play with Stokes that made you upset, and then you hopped into the back?
That hurts. Like, the ref can't miss that, and then I have to play with a contusion in my leg the rest of the game. Like, it's ridiculous.
Courtside cameras caught something that was never supposed to be on tape. It's halftime at a crucial WNBA game, and Caitlin Clark, the rookie phenom who's been breaking records left and right, comes charging toward her head coach Stephanie White with fury in her eyes. And what happens next isn't a private conversation. It's a public reckoning. Clark snaps something at White, gestures sharply toward the court, and shakes her head in a way that says everything without saying much. The cameras can't quite catch the words, but the message is crystal clear. Something is broken. Something has been building for weeks, maybe months. And this is the moment everyone in the WNBA had to stop pretending everything was fine. What made this different from a typical player-coach disagreement? Why did this moment go viral instantly? Why are league executives, rival coaches, and veteran players suddenly asking themselves if their own locker rooms are about to explode the same way? Because this wasn't just about basketball. It was about power, control, and who gets to decide how the game is actually played. This is the story of how a rookie just rewrote the rules of player empowerment in women's basketball and why nobody will ever look at the WNBA the same way again. The Indiana Fever were in the middle of a game that should have been a statement. Instead, it became a confession. As the second quarter wound down, you could feel something shifting in the arena, not the momentum on the court, but the tension behind it. Caitlin Clark had been trying all season to fit into a system that felt like wearing someone else's shoes. Slower, tighter, built for a different era of basketball. But this game, something snapped. What you're about to understand is that this wasn't just about one bad quarter or one missed rotation. This was the exact moment when a generational talent finally decided she was done compromising, done waiting, done being polite while her team played basketball that contradicted everything she was built to do. The halftime confrontation with Stephanie White was the spark, but the real story is what came before it and what comes after. Because when a player with Clark's level of prominence, her star power, her ability to move markets and influence sponsorships, finally speaks up on national television, it changes the gravity of an entire league. This is about the collision between old basketball and new basketball, between tradition and transformation, and between a coach trying to maintain control and a star determined to lead. Everything you need to know starts right here. Imagine sitting courtside in that arena when it happened. The second quarter is wrapping up, and the Indiana Fever are playing exactly the kind of basketball that has defined their season: methodical, controlled, and somehow frustratingly slow despite having one of the most dynamic offensive weapons in the league. Caitlin Clark is moving around the court, trying to create, trying to push pace, trying to do what she's been doing since she stepped foot in the WNBA. But the system keeps pulling her back. Possessions are grinding. Rotations are off. Veterans are dribbling into contested mid-range shots, while Clark stands on the perimeter watching. Then comes the play. Stokes drives, there's contact that the referees completely miss, and Caitlin Clark takes a hard hit. She gets up with a visible contusion forming, frustrated not just because she's hurt, but because the ref should have caught it. This isn't a one-time thing either. It's been happening all game. Missed calls, missed rotations, missed opportunities to play the way she knows the team should be playing. As the quarter ends and both teams head to the locker room, Clark doesn't walk slowly. She charges toward the bench where Coach Stephanie White is standing with her clipboard, and what happens next is the kind of moment that gets replayed thousands of times on social media within minutes. Clark confronts White directly. Her jaw is tight. Her eyes are sharp. She gestures toward the court and says something that the cameras don't quite capture, but the body language says everything. This isn't frustration about one play. This is weeks or months of frustration finally boiling over. What makes this different from typical locker room intensity is the authenticity of it. This isn't a diva having a meltdown because she didn't get enough touches. This is a star player, one who understands basketball at an elite level, trying to communicate something crucial to her coach, and doing it in a way that shows she's reached the end of her patience. Even the assistant coaches froze. The energy shifted. Everyone in that room knew something significant had just happened. But here's what makes this moment so important to understand. Caitlin Clark wasn't just speaking for herself. She was speaking for every young player who has ever been asked to compromise their talent to fit into a system that doesn't maximize it. She was speaking for every rookie who's been told to keep quiet and pay their dues instead of being trusted to lead. She was speaking for every star in the WNBA who's watching and thinking, if she can say something, maybe I can too. The halftime confrontation itself lasted seconds, maybe a minute at most. But the ripple effect would reverberate through the entire league. Podcasts started dissecting it. TikTok clips went viral with different interpretations. Some people saw it as disrespect toward authority. Others saw it as exactly what leadership looks like when a player has finally had enough. The media fractured into camps almost instantly. But one thing everyone agreed on. Something fundamental had shifted. What's crucial to understand is that this moment didn't come from nowhere. Clark had been trying to communicate her concerns through normal channels for weeks. In team meetings, she'd suggested quicker tempo sets. She provided input on spacing and rotations. She'd pointed out the inefficiencies in the Fever's transition defense and suggested different approaches. And for the most part, she'd been met with polite nods and silence. Coaches had adjusted nothing. The system had remained exactly the same. So when that moment came at halftime, it wasn't an explosion of ego. It was the sound of someone who had exhausted every professional channel for communication finally speaking the truth out loud. And the thing about speaking truth in a locker room full of cameras is that you can't unsay it. You can't walk it back. It's on tape. It's on the internet. Every executive in the WNBA saw it. Every coach watched it. Every player understood what it meant. The Fever would come back out for the second half and something changed. Clark emerged with fury in her eyes and immediately went to work. She made 3 deep threes in less than 5 minutes. She started commanding the offense instead of playing within it. She pushed the pace relentlessly. And suddenly the Fever looked like a playoff contender instead of a team playing basketball from 3 decades ago. The offense flowed. Teammates moved without the ball. Spacing opened up. It was like watching someone finally take control of their own destiny. Coach White sat on the bench mostly silent, watching as the team she'd been trying to control was suddenly controlling itself much more effectively. The arena went nuclear. Fans could see it too. This was better basketball. Faster basketball. The kind that actually showcased what Caitlin Clark could do. And it was happening because she'd finally snapped at halftime and forced the conversation that should have been happening all along. What nobody could deny was the evidence. The numbers would back it up later. The eye test confirmed it in real time. When you trust your generational talent and let her set the pace, your team wins more games. It's that simple. But the real question wasn't whether it worked. The real question was whether the Indiana Fever organization had the courage to admit that everything they'd been doing was wrong, and whether they were willing to fundamentally rebuild their system around a rookie who just called them out on national television. To understand why Caitlin Clark snapped at halftime, you have to understand what she's been dealing with all season. This isn't about a single bad quarter or one missed call. This is about the collision between 2 completely different philosophies of basketball, and how a 22-year-old rookie found herself trapped between them. Coach Stephanie White comes from a generation of basketball coaches who built their careers on structure, discipline, and control. The kind of coach who believes that mistakes are prevented through repetition, that possessions are won through spacing and execution of called plays, and that freedom is something you earn, not something you're given from day one. This approach had success in the early 2000s WNBA, when the league was fighting for consistency and respectability. Back then, limiting turnovers and grinding out wins seemed like the path forward. But Caitlin Clark grew up in a completely different basketball world. She dominated college basketball for 4 years at Iowa, by doing things that older basketball minds said were impossible. She took 3-pointers from 35 feet away. She threw no-look passes across half-court. She ran offenses at maximum pace. She broke conventions because she understood something that her opponents didn't. Modern basketball rewards speed, spacing, and creativity. The game has evolved and so have the athletes playing it. The problem is that when Clark arrived in Indiana, she was asked to fundamentally change who she is as a player. Not to improve, not to develop skills she was lacking, but to play slower, to dribble less, to operate within a structure designed for veterans and guard-heavy systems built in a different era. Every time she wanted to push pace, she'd hear the whistle or see a rotation that didn't match her speed. Every time she wanted to create on the fly, she'd watch a play call that forced the offense into a specific pattern that didn't fit the moment. What makes this so frustrating is that Clark was doing exactly what any professional should do. She was trying to fit in. She was trying to be a good teammate and respect the system her coach had set up. But what that meant was playing at 70% of her actual capacity. It meant suppressing her instincts. It meant watching her teammates struggle to keep up with her pace, not because they weren't capable, but because the system wasn't designed to run at that speed. Think about what this feels like from Clark's perspective. You've spent 4 years revolutionizing your sport. You've broken every scoring record. You've made plays that had commentators speechless. You've proven that you can read defenses 3 steps ahead of where they're moving. You understand spacing better than most coaches. And then you get to the WNBA, and you're told to slow down, to simplify, to let veteran players make decisions even when you can see the better option, to be patient, to wait your turn. The tragedy of this situation is that it's not really about White being a bad coach. She's knowledgeable. She's experienced. But she's also trapped in a coaching philosophy that assumes the best way to maximize a star player is to constrain them with structure, to make them fit into an existing system rather than building a system around their strengths. It's the opposite of how every other generational talent in basketball has been developed. Compare this to how the NBA treats its young stars. When Luka Doncic showed up in the league, Jason Kidd didn't ask him to play slower. He didn't tell him to stop taking difficult shots. He didn't make him follow a rigid offensive structure that limited his creativity. Instead, Kidd built the entire system around Luka's strengths. When Steph Curry entered the league, the Warriors eventually realized that the best way to maximize him was to unleash him, not to control him. When LeBron was young, his teams found ways to let him dominate while still maintaining structure. But in women's basketball, there's a different standard. There's this assumption that young players need to be taught discipline first, that they need to prove themselves within an existing framework before they can reshape it. The problem is that this framework was never designed for someone like Caitlin Clark. It was designed for balanced rosters and veteran leadership. It doesn't account for a generational talent who can single-handedly change the way a team plays. What Clark was trying to communicate at halftime was simple. The system is holding me back. Not because I need more discipline. Not because I need to learn humility. But because the pace is too slow. The spacing is inconsistent. The trust in young players to execute complex decisions is too low. And most importantly, when I have the ball and I see a play develop, I should be trusted to make the right decision without a coach second-guessing it from the sideline. The real tension isn't between Clark and White personally. It's between 2 different eras of basketball trying to occupy the same locker room. And Clark finally reached the breaking point where she decided that compromise wasn't working anymore. Here's something that doesn't always make it into the highlight reels and social media clips. The halftime confrontation with Coach White wasn't just about coaching philosophy. It also exposed something that had been festering in the Indiana Fever locker room for weeks. A generational divide. A split between players who were comfortable with how things had always been done and players who understood that change was necessary. Kelsey Mitchell is the perfect example of this dynamic. She's been the face of the Fever for years. She's invested time in this organization. She's played through injuries. She's been the go-to scorer when the team needed buckets. And then suddenly a 22-year-old rookie arrives and there's this unspoken question hanging in the air. What's going to happen to my role? What does it mean for my future if this young star becomes the centerpiece of the offense? This isn't really about Mitchell being a bad player or a bad teammate. It's about ego, pride, and the natural human fear of being surpassed or made less relevant. When you've been the primary ball handler and the team's leader, and then someone younger and more gifted arrives with the potential to overshadow you, that's a difficult thing to process. And Mitchell, to her credit, because this is incredibly human, started to show that tension in her play. The ISOs increased. The forced shots got more frequent. The willingness to move without the ball and create spacing for Clark decreased. It's subtle stuff that doesn't show up in box scores, but it's visible to anyone watching closely. Mitchell was essentially saying without words, "This is still my team." And when Clark tried to accelerate the pace and move the ball, Mitchell would slow things down. When Clark wanted to run fast breaks, Mitchell would dribble into contested mid-range shots. It created a friction that made the entire offense feel disjointed. Other veterans picked up on this energy too. There's a mentality in professional basketball where seniority carries weight. You pay your dues. You respect the pecking order. You don't challenge the established hierarchy, especially not as a rookie. And when Clark started doing exactly that, not being disrespectful, but asserting her vision for how the team should play, some players took it as a threat. According to reports from people close to the team, the tension in the locker room reached a boiling point when Clark confronted a teammate about a missed transition opportunity. The teammate fired back with something along the lines of, "You're not the only one on this team." And that comment said everything. It wasn't really about basketball. It was about feeling threatened. About feeling like the young superstar was taking over and pushing out the old guard. This created a split right down the middle of the roster. On one side, you had younger players, rookies and second-year players, who grew up watching Caitlin Clark dominate at Iowa. They understood what she was trying to do. They wanted to play faster. They wanted to move without the ball. They wanted to embrace the modern style of basketball that actually maximizes her talents. They saw possibility in her vision. On the other side, you had the veterans who believed in the old way. Discipline, structure, earn trust. The idea that you don't just hand a 22-year-old the keys to the franchise. You make her prove it first. You make her fit into what's already established. You don't rebuild everything around one player, no matter how good that player is. The tragedy of this split is that it made the locker room colder. There were moments where you could see the glances, the hesitation, the arms crossed during timeouts. Players were no longer unified in their purpose. They were split into camps. And when your locker room is divided like that, your basketball suffers. Your chemistry breaks down. Guys aren't as willing to sacrifice for each other. What makes this situation even more complex is that nobody is actually wrong. The veterans have legitimate reasons to want to protect their roles and their dignity. Mitchell has been a solid NBA player. The other veterans have earned respect through years of service. But Clark also has a legitimate point. If you're going to build around her, you actually have to build around her. You can't ask her to conform to a system that doesn't match her talents, and then be surprised when the team underperforms. The halftime explosion essentially forced the issue. By calling out the coaching in front of everyone, Clark also made a statement to her teammates. "I'm not waiting. I'm not compromising anymore." And that either inspires people to get on board or it deepens the rift. For some players, it was inspiration. They thought, "Finally, someone's saying what we've all been thinking." For others, it felt like a power grab. What happened in the second half proved something crucial, though. When Clark took over and ran the offense her way, the younger players responded immediately. The spacing improved. The ball movement got crisp. The pace accelerated. And suddenly everyone looked better. Even Mitchell, eventually, seemed to understand that keeping up with Clark's pace instead of fighting against it was the better way to win games. But that locker room divide is still there. It's not fully healed. And depending on how the Fever organization responds in the coming weeks, it could either deepen or resolve. The front office now has to decide. Do they support the veterans and the existing structure? Or do they support the future and the star player who's demanding change? Here's the thing about Caitlin Clark's halftime confrontation that skeptics couldn't argue with. It worked. Immediately. Dramatically. Undeniably. And the evidence wasn't just anecdotal. The statistics backed up everything she was fighting for. In the third quarter after the halftime explosion, the Fever went on an absolute tear. They scored 30 points. Not just any 30 points, but 30 points of basketball that looked completely different from what they've been running all season. The ball was moving. Guys were running. The pace was elevated. And suddenly, every player on the roster looked better. This wasn't a coincidence or a fluke. This was what actually good basketball looks like when you trust your generational talent to set the tone. Think about the offensive efficiency numbers. Before halftime, the Fever were playing at a glacial pace. Possessions were dragging on. They were getting to the end of the shot clock with forced shots. Turnover rates were climbing because the half-court offense was so rigid that players were trying to do things within a system that didn't fit their skills. The spacing was inconsistent. Rotations were late. This wasn't just aesthetically bad basketball, it was mathematically inefficient basketball. Then Clark took over. The pace increased from something like 95 possessions per 100 minutes to well over 100. Suddenly, the Fever were playing at a speed that actually allowed them to create advantages before defenses could set. Transition opportunities increased. Open threes became available because the spacing opened up when players moved at higher speed. And most importantly, the decision-making got sharper because everyone on the court was locked into what Clark was trying to do. The assist numbers tell a story too. In the first half, the Fever had something like 6 or 7 assists. Isolation ball. One-on-one plays. Each possession kind of standing alone without building into the next one. In the second half, when Clark controlled the pace, they had double digits in assists. The ball was moving player to player. There was flow. There was continuity. And every player was getting looks because the offense was actually creating opportunities instead of just running out the clock. But here's the number that really matters. Points. The Fever put up 99 points against Dallas. In a WNBA game, 99 points is dominant. It's not just a good score. It's a statement. Some analysts tried to argue afterward that this was a statistical anomaly. That Clark stat line was inflated. That Dallas's defense was just having an off night. But if you watched the tape, actually watched it, you could see the difference. This wasn't about one player going off. This was about a team playing coherent modern basketball and being rewarded for it. The spacing on the court changed dramatically too. Here's something that casual basketball fans might not think about, but it's absolutely crucial. When you play faster, defenses have less time to set up. When defenses don't have time to set up, they can't pack the paint. When they can't pack the paint, your best shooter has more room to operate. In the second half, Caitlin Clark got significantly more space on her three-point attempts because the Fever were playing at a pace that prevented the defense from loading up on her. The field goal percentage reflected this reality. In the first half, the Fever were shooting somewhere in the low 40s. Below average. They were settling for tough looks because the system wasn't generating good shots. In the second half, they climbed toward 50% shooting. Better looks. Better rhythm. Better results. All of this because one player finally said, "We need to play faster." Another crucial stat. Turnover differential. This is where the traditionalist argument really falls apart. If Coach White's slow, controlled system was so effective at limiting mistakes, why did the Fever turn the ball over less when they sped up? Because turnovers often happen when players are trying to force things within a system that doesn't fit their strengths. When you let players play freely within a system that matches their talents, decision-making actually improves. Players know where they're supposed to go. They see the defense faster. They make quicker, sharper choices. The rebounding numbers showed growth too. In the fast-paced second half, the Fever were more aggressive on the glass. More active. More engaged. Faster pace doesn't mean less physical. It means more energy. More transition game. More second chance opportunities created by the other team having less time to set their defense. And here's the thing that coaches can't argue with. The opponent's bench scored fewer points in the second half. When you play fast, when you press the pace, when you make the other team uncomfortable, their rotation players get less rhythm. Bench guys can't settle into a game when they're constantly running and being forced to make quick defensive adjustments. Every single metric, pace, spacing, efficiency, assists, field goal percentage, turnovers, transition opportunities improved dramatically when Caitlin Clark essentially took over the offense and played the way she'd been asking to play all season. This wasn't opinion. This wasn't debate. This was measurable proof that the system Clark wanted was objectively better than the system Coach White had been implementing. And that's what made the halftime explosion so powerful. It wasn't just emotionally valid. It was statistically vindicated within 12 minutes of the second half. The Fever proved on the court that everything Clark had been fighting for made sense. They proved that she understood basketball better than the system that was constraining her. And they proved that when you trust a generational talent, you get generational results. Here's what nobody's really talked about yet. Caitlin Clark's halftime explosion wasn't just an Indiana Fever issue. It sent shockwaves through the entire WNBA. And right now, in locker rooms across the league, other young stars are paying very close attention to how the Fever organization responds. Because if there's one thing that players at the highest level understand, it's leverage. And what Clark just did was rewrite the script on how young stars can use their leverage in women's basketball. She didn't do it in a contract negotiation behind closed doors. She didn't do it during the off-season when cameras aren't watching. She did it live. On national television. In a moment where everyone in the league saw her not just claiming power, but actually demonstrating it. Think about the message this sends to every second-year player stuck behind a veteran who refuses to move. Every rookie point guard whose coach insists on running an outdated system. Every talented young player who's been told to be patient, to wait their turn, to respect the hierarchy. Clark just showed them that if you have talent, real, undeniable, market-moving talent, you don't have to wait. You can demand change. And if you're good enough, the change might actually happen. Within days, players across the WNBA were talking about it. Not publicly necessarily, but in group chats, in team meetings, in private conversations. Some of the conversations were admiring. That's what leadership looks like. Others were more calculating. She just showed us how to do this. And a few were probably concerned. What happens if my young star watches this and decides it's time for me to step aside? The Paige Bueckers comparison is inevitable here. Bueckers came into the league with a similar kind of hype. She's an elite scorer, a crafty playmaker, incredibly skilled. But she's been more willing to fit into a system, more patient with the traditional progression of a young player earning their role. After facing off with Clark, Bueckers gave a post-game interview that was calm and professional on the surface, but there was an edge underneath. They got us today. We'll meet them again. There was a promise in that statement. A resolve. And you could see it in her eyes, the competitive fire, the recognition that her approach might need to shift. This is the beginning of something bigger in women's basketball. You're going to start seeing young stars demand more input into how their teams are constructed. You're going to see players like Hannah Hidalgo, like Juju Watkins, like other generational talents coming up the pipeline, watching what Clark is doing and understanding that they don't have to accept mediocre systems just because that's how things have always been done. The coaching community is already nervous about this. There's talk behind closed doors in locker rooms across the country. General managers are asking each other, is our young star the next one to blow up at halftime? Coaches are wondering if they're going to face similar confrontations. Because once one player successfully leverages their talent and star power to force systemic change, other players start to believe they can do it too. This is actually healthy for the league, even though it's uncomfortable for the old guard. The NBA figured this out years ago. Star power drives the league. Star power sells tickets. Star power moves the needle on television ratings. And when you have a real generational talent, the best thing you can do is build around that talent, not try to fit the talent into an existing structure. Clark just demonstrated that principle in real time, and now every executive in the WNBA has to reckon with it. There's also a ripple effect in how the league itself is covered. The halftime explosion went viral. It dominated sports news. People who don't normally watch WNBA games saw clips of it and got curious. Why is this happening? What's the conflict? And suddenly, the league is part of a narrative that's more compelling than just games and stats. It's about the culture of basketball, about power dynamics, about who gets to decide how the game is played. Sponsors and broadcasters notice this too. When something becomes cultural currency like this, it increases the value of the league. Networks want to show more Fever games because there's drama. There's a story. There's something interesting happening beyond just wins and losses. And Caitlin Clark, whether she intended to or not, created that moment. She made the WNBA must-watch television not because the basketball was suddenly better, but because there's a legitimate conflict that needs resolution. The economic impact is already being measured. Merchandise sales spike when there's controversy. Ticket prices go up when there's intrigue. Television ratings increase when people want to know what's going to happen next. And all of this is directly tied to Caitlin Clark's willingness to confront her coach on national television. The league is also at a crucial moment culturally. For years, women's basketball has been fighting for respect and viewership. Part of that fight has meant being professional, being respectful, being the opposite of the NBA in terms of drama and controversy. But Clark just proved that maybe that approach was limiting the league's potential. Maybe the league becomes more compelling when young stars are allowed to be ambitious, when they're allowed to push back, when they're allowed to be human about their competitive drives instead of always being polished and diplomatic. Other young stars in the league are seeing this and understanding that the era of just accepting whatever system you're put into is over. The era of waiting patiently for your opportunity is changing. If you're good enough, if you move the needle enough, if you can demonstrate that you understand the game better than the system being imposed on you, you can demand change. And Caitlin Clark just taught everyone in the WNBA that lesson. That here's something that often gets lost in the basketball debate, but it's arguably more important than any on-court argument. Caitlin Clark is making the Indiana Fever a tremendous amount of money, and that economic reality is why her confrontation with coach Stephanie White carries so much weight beyond just sports. When Clark was drafted by Indiana, the organization suddenly became relevant in ways they hadn't been in years. Ticket sales increased. Merchandise started flying off shelves. Television networks that had been indifferent to the WNBA suddenly wanted to feature Fever games in primetime slots. Local media that hadn't covered the team in years started sending camera crews. The economic impact wasn't subtle. It was immediately measurable and it was significant. Think about the sponsorship implications. Nike didn't create a special signature shoe for Caitlin Clark because she was just another WNBA rookie. They did it because they understood that her star power transcends basketball. She's a cultural figure. She's someone who can move product. She's someone who makes brands more relevant by association. That shoe release didn't happen because of shooting percentages. It happened because Nike recognized her as an economic asset with incredible growth potential. The television deals tell a similar story. When the Fever are on ESPN, ratings spike. Not because the basketball is objectively the best basketball on television that night, but because Caitlin Clark is playing. Viewers tune in to see what she's going to do. They stay tuned to watch the drama unfold. Networks are willing to pay more for broadcasting rights to games featuring her. And every executive in the league knows this. Merchandise sales are through the roof. Fever jerseys with her number are consistently among the top-selling WNBA jerseys. You can't keep them in stock. People are buying them who don't even necessarily follow basketball closely. They're buying them because Clark represents something: ambition, talent, a new generation of women's athletics that's uncompromising in its pursuit of excellence. That's extraordinarily valuable from a business perspective. The arena attendance numbers are equally telling. When the Fever are in town, stadiums are full. Not just full, sold out. Local arenas that might have had 3,000 people show up for a typical WNBA game are now having crowds of 10,000, 15,000, sometimes more. That's ticket revenue. That's concession revenue. That's parking and merchandise at the arena. That's economic activity that extends beyond the basketball game itself, into the entire ecosystem around it. The local business impact in Indianapolis is real too. Hotels are more booked when the Fever play at home. Restaurants near the arena do better business. There's more taxi and transportation usage. When you have a star player who draws crowds, you create economic opportunity for the entire community. The Fever organization knows this. The city knows this. And that's exactly why when Clark snaps at her coach about the system not working, it's not just a basketball disagreement. It's a threat to that entire economic ecosystem. Here's where it gets really interesting. The front office can't afford to let this situation deteriorate. If Caitlin Clark becomes unhappy enough to demand a trade or to leave during free agency, the economic impact would be devastating. The merchandise revenue dries up. The television ratings drop. The merchandise sales plummet. Sponsorships potentially become less valuable because the star power that made them valuable is no longer there. It's not hyperbole to say that the economic future of the franchise depends significantly on keeping Caitlin Clark engaged and happy. This is exactly why the halftime confrontation matters so much at the organizational level. It's not just about basketball. It's a wake-up call to the front office. You have a generational talent who is willing to challenge the status quo because she believes in a better way to play basketball. If you want to keep that talent, if you want to maintain the economic value she's bringing to the franchise, you have to listen to what she's saying. Nike is also watching this situation closely. If Caitlin Clark becomes unhappy with the Fever, Nike might decide to shift its investment toward another young star. The partnership they've built with Clark is valuable, but it's only valuable if she's happy and thriving. If she's stuck in a system that doesn't maximize her abilities, that damages the Nike brand association too. They've invested in her as a transformative figure in women's sports. They need her to be transformative. The broader media landscape is watching as well. Every major sports media outlet wants access to Caitlin Clark. Every podcast wants her as a guest. Every magazine wants an interview. That access and that platform are valuable leverage. If the Fever organization isn't treating her right, other organizations will. Other teams might not be able to match Indiana's roster, but they could potentially offer her a better coaching situation and a system more aligned with her vision. The economic argument is actually the strongest argument for the Fever to give Clark what she wants. Because when you strip away all the basketball philosophy debate, what you're left with is simple economics. Caitlin Clark makes the Indiana Fever significantly more valuable. When you have an asset that valuable, you don't constrain it. You maximize it. You build everything around it. That's not sentiment. That's just good business. Stephanie White is a good coach. It's important to establish that because the narrative around this confrontation sometimes becomes oversimplified into bad coach versus good player. That's not what this is. White is knowledgeable. She's experienced. She's won games. But she's also trapped in a situation where her coaching philosophy and the reality of her roster are fundamentally misaligned. White comes from a generation of coaches who were trained in a specific approach to basketball: control, structure, discipline. The idea that you win games by limiting mistakes, by controlling possessions, by running sets that have been executed 1,000 times so that execution is automatic. That approach worked for decades. It won championships. It built programs. And there's nothing inherently wrong with that philosophy in a vacuum. But coaching isn't a vacuum. Coaching is about reading your personnel and maximizing their strengths. And Stephanie White has been given a roster that includes one of the most talented ball handlers and decision-makers in basketball history. And she's been trying to fit that player into a system that was designed for a different era of basketball. The problem isn't that White doesn't know basketball. The problem is that she's asking a generational talent to play in a way that contradicts that talent's greatest strengths. It would be like asking an NBA team with Steph Curry to avoid three-point shooting because that's not how basketball was played 20 years ago. It would be like telling LeBron James to stay in the post and stop running the offense through his playmaking. You'd be deliberately handicapping your greatest asset. White has coaching options here, and they're all difficult. She could continue to do what she's been doing, maintain her system, ask Clark to conform, hope that eventually Clark accepts the reality of the WNBA and adapts to the way the league should be played. But Caitlin Clark just demonstrated on national television that she's not willing to accept that. She's not going to gradually conform to a system she disagrees with. She's going to push back. And as the season goes on, that pushback will likely become louder, not quieter. The second option is to adapt. To acknowledge that her coaching philosophy needs to evolve to match the reality of her roster. To accept that the game has changed, that modern basketball is faster and more space-oriented, and that Caitlin Clark is at the forefront of that evolution. If White goes this route, she has to fundamentally reconsider how she structures the offense. She has to increase pace. She has to give Clark more freedom in decision-making. She has to trust that Clark's basketball intelligence is genuine and act accordingly. This option is difficult for White because it requires admitting that her previous approach wasn't optimal. It means accepting that a rookie knows something about basketball that she doesn't. And for coaches, especially head coaches who've built their entire careers on a specific philosophy, that's a hard pill to swallow. But it's the option that actually has the potential to work long-term. The third option is that White gets replaced. If the Fever organization decides that the coach's philosophy is fundamentally incompatible with Caitlin Clark's vision for the team, they might decide that it's easier to find a new coach than to find a new generational talent. This is the nuclear option, but it's on the table. It would send a message to the rest of the league: if you can't coach a star player effectively, you'll be replaced. And for White, it would be a professional setback that she might not recover from. What makes this situation particularly complex is that White's job performance is being measured against changing standards. 6 months ago, before Caitlin Clark arrived, White might have been considered a decent WNBA coach. Now she's being measured against the question: can she maximize a generational talent? And by that standard, she hasn't done well. The on-court evidence, the halftime explosion, the locker room tension, all of it suggests that White and Clark are not aligned. There's also a generational and cultural gap that's hard to bridge. White comes from a time in basketball when respect for authority and hierarchy were paramount. When young players were seen and not heard. When you earned your role through years of service and proving yourself within the system. Clark comes from a different era where young players who are talented enough demand agency and autonomy from day one. Neither perspective is inherently wrong. They're just different. And it's very difficult for someone steeped in one approach to suddenly flip to another. What White could do, and what might save her job, is to approach this with humility. To sit down with Clark and essentially say, "You understand something about how to play this game that I need to learn. How do we adapt our system to work better for you, while still maintaining the structure that helps the rest of the team succeed?" This would require White to subordinate her ego to the greater good of winning. It would require her to trust a 22-year-old. And for a head coach, that's incredibly difficult. But the alternative is to stand on principle and risk losing a generational talent. Risk becoming the coach who had Caitlin Clark and couldn't figure out how to maximize her. Risk becoming the cautionary tale that every coaching hire in the WNBA learns from going forward. White's at an inflection point in her career. And the next few weeks are going to define how history remembers her. Strip away the specifics of the Indiana Fever, Caitlin Clark, and Stephanie White for a moment, and what you're actually looking at is a fundamental cultural shift in women's basketball. This isn't just about one team or one coach or even one player. This is about who gets to decide how the game is played and what values the sport prioritizes. For decades, the WNBA and women's basketball more broadly has operated under a certain unspoken set of rules. Rookies defer to veterans. Young players earn their stripes before they lead. Respect for hierarchy and tradition is paramount. Stars are supposed to be grateful for their opportunity, not demanding about their role. Coaches set the system and players fit into it. This approach was framed as professionalism, respectability, and maturity. But here's what's become increasingly clear. That approach may have actually been limiting the league's potential. Because while the NBA was celebrating stars like LeBron and Steph Curry who demanded agency and reshaped their teams around their talents, the WNBA was asking its young stars to be grateful and compliant. And the league was suffering for it. Not in obvious ways but in the subtler ways that affect cultural relevance and market value. Caitlin Clark is forcing a reckoning with that dynamic. She's saying loudly, publicly, undeniably that the old rules don't apply to her. She's not here to wait her turn. She's not here to gradually earn the right to lead. She's here to transform the league, and she's going to start by transforming her own team, whether the people in charge are ready for that or not.